Good evening, everyone. I'm Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Truro University, and welcome to the FOLCS Conversation Series. Tonight, our very special guest, retired General David Petraeus. Many of you know that he commanded the United States and NATO forces in both Iraq and Afghanistan. He's one of America's most brilliant military strategists historically, in many ways, legendary battlefield commander in, I think, 8 different settings. He is the architect of a term of art that we all now know, the Surge, which was part of the Sunni awakening that took place both in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was also the director of the CIA during a period of time during the War on Terror. He's the co-author of a recent book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. And given the shape of the world and the military conflicts around, he's the perfect guest tonight. If there is a Mount Rushmore for wartime American generals, he's probably on it. And so let's welcome General David Petraeus. General, welcome to FOLCS.
Good to be with you, Thane. Thanks. It's a privilege to be on the forum. And a shout out to Tom Kaplan, who's the one who encouraged me to do this, a very long time friend and fellow traveler.
Well, he admires you greatly. Your name comes up in lots of conversations, so I'm glad Tom was invoked. So let me just start. I'm sorry, say that again.
I feel the same way about him.
A lot of mutual affection. So let me start off with more mutual affection. I want to thank you for your service, 37 years in the military. You're now a civilian. And I guess the first question to ask you is, do you miss the military?
Oh, sure. I think that anyone who has served in uniform, frankly, particularly at a time of war, we don't hope for war, but if there is one, we want to contribute and be with our fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And I was privileged to do that perhaps more than anyone in modern times, certainly the only person to command 2 different wars at their height. But at the end of the day, that phase of life is over. You can't go back to it. You can think about it, I guess, nostalgically, or certainly with a degree of quiet pride, and certainly share the experiences that we had with the others. It's always great, for example, to be back with the members of my military tribe, just as it is great to be back with those I was privileged to serve with at the CIA. But again, life is a series of unfolding adventures, and I've had a terrific adventure, frankly, since leaving government over 10 and a half years ago. I have had a number of academic appointments during that time. Right now, I teach at Yale. I'm the Kissinger Fellow there, course on great power competition in the spring semester for graduate students. I'm a partner at KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which does geopolitical risk for those investments in which that's involved. And it's a much greater number now than it was when I joined the firm 10 and a half years ago, when we were enjoying a period of benign globalization, and now we're in a period of renewed great power rivalries. I'm on boards, I support think tanks, so it's and you mentioned the book kindly. That tour is still going on to some degree. I was just out at the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, which was a real pleasure. So life is full, and we have 3 growing on 4 grandkids, and so I continue to be very fortunate.
A lot of blessings. I'm curious, does the skill set for 37 years of the military translate on Wall Street and other of your private now endeavors? The reason I ask you is because in the book Startup Nation, about Israel's technology culture and the startup corporations, it actually mentioned that IDF training, Israeli Defense Force training, had something to do with the high-tech ingenuity, the improvisational skills, the ability to work together in coordination. I wonder whether you see that translating well in that very different esprit de corps of global finance.
Well, I do. Again, it's in different sectors, and of course it depends on what the individual did during his or her career. My career was not necessarily the most standard of careers. I was allowed to go to graduate school at one point in time. I spent 2 years at Princeton and did a master's and then a PhD in a combination of international relations and economics. I taught both those courses, again, not necessarily the standard career path for an infantry officer. I did a fellowship at Georgetown instead of doing the War College. And then I deployed to Haiti to be the chief of operations for the United Nations force there, rather than actually complete the fellowship, which was in lieu of the War College. And so there were a lot of different experiences, and I'd like to think some expertise developed along the way. But it's different in each case. I'd also point out that, by the way, I'm also a personal venture capitalist. I've invested in about 28 startups, many of them multiple rounds since leaving government 10 and a half years ago. And in several in Israel, I should note. And some of them, of course, I knew the individuals. I mean, one of them was chaired by the former head of Mossad, my partner at that time, Tamir Pardo, and one of his deputy directors, who is one of the great cyber experts of the world. And they created a penetration testing firm. I mean, I said, you don't even need to tell me anything more about it. I'm in, save me this much room. And so again, it does depend a great deal also on what the individuals actually did. There's a huge desire for those that served in Unit 8200, of course, the Israeli version of the National Security Agency. The same is true of various elements within, again, Mossad or Shin Bet or others, and it carries over into the military. So again, you have to really, though, ask, what's the sector? What is the specific task the individual is performing? How did his or her expertise, experience, values, etc., contribute to that? In some cases, very high-tech elements of the economy, which have been so very important. I think you see directly, again, the impact of particularly those that were in the very elite elements.
General, we're living in an era when there's a declining sense of confidence and faith in some of our institutions, whether it's the government or the Supreme Court or mainstream media or even the Ivy League. What is your sense of the American military and America's perception of our military? And in answering that, I'm also curious whether the esprit de corps within the military, in your judgment, as having commanded so many different phases of our military, is still high. Is there still faith in the American military? And do the service persons themselves still feel a sense of deep connection and patriotism in their service?
Yeah, no, the answer to that is very much yes. Certainly the generation that I was privileged to lead in combat in particular, I believe deserves to be recognized as America's new greatest generation. And I've said that repeatedly. These are individuals who raised their right hand at a time of war, volunteered to serve, re-enlisted in many cases for additional tours in uniform, knowing that they'd go back to combat. In fact, I presided over the largest re-enlistment ceremony in our history, which was in the second summer of the surge in Iraq. So we're at the 18-month mark. And as I looked out at them, 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, asking myself, what was this all about? Because it wasn't about the stock options or something like that. And actually, the summer of 2008, we didn't realize that we were on the precipice of the Great Recession. The economy still seemed to be very strong. And I realized that this is about individuals who feel privileged to serve a mission larger than self at a time of war, who also feel privileged to do it with others who feel the same way and came in for the same reasons, and then enjoyed the support of the American people, the appreciation of the American people, even if those people disagreed at times with the policies that we were implementing. So again, I think the military was absolutely superb. When I was privileged to lead America's sons and daughters and coalition sons and daughters in combat, I think that is still very much the case. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges for the military in a variety of different ways. One of the issues that the Army in particular is grappling with is recruiting shortfalls. which are actually very easily explained. We've been in a period of a historic low unemployment, sustained low unemployment. The number of young people who actually qualify for service, who can meet the physical standards, the criminal background check, mental health standards, education standards, is lower, and the propensity to serve is down, in part, perhaps, by the way, because we're not at a time of war. And so the services have to work harder, and they are, and they have plans to figure out how to navigate these challenges. And to be sure, the military is not immune from getting caught in the crossfire of the culture wars and some of this that where people seek to make political points by taking various or making various statements. But I think at the end of the day, the U.S. military has been and continues to be an extraordinary gathering of men and women, all volunteers who are the best in the world and also have the best training and the best equipment of the world. Not to say that China is not closing various gaps. It's not to say that there aren't many challenges. In fact, I think if you characterize the current situation, you would observe that we face the largest number of challenges and threats and the greatest complexity of those challenges and threats, I would argue, since the end of World War II, not just the end of the Cold War. So it's a very, very challenging landscape for the U.S. military, but I believe that we are equal to the challenge. And if the country can come together sufficiently, really in Capitol Hill in particular, and come to grips with the various issues that are required, I think we're very capable of meeting those challenges.
You know, during the period of your service, there was always some people talking or questioning. Even President Obama questioned the concept of American exceptionalism. And I just want to go back to the idea of and there's cynicism, of course, when it comes to this idea of America's involvement in the world. And there are people that think that America has withdrawn from the world, disengaged from the world. Can you just speak to that and maybe also address the idea that clearly you are of the view that America is still very much a force for good in global affairs?
No, I do. Look, I'm not oblivious to the fact that there are decisions that you might look back on and question some years later. I do believe we're, an exceptional country, but that doesn't mean we're not without flaws and that we don't make missteps, and that we occasionally don't get a little bit too full of our exceptionalism and perhaps take actions that, again, you look back on and think perhaps we might have been a bit more measured in what it was that we sought to do. Again, that said, we are the number one economy in the world, and we're the number one economy for a variety of different reasons that have to do with, again, essentially the nature of our system. Democracy, again, I share with Churchill, the worst form of government except for all the others. He also observed, of course, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after doing all the other things. So again, I think we should have a degree of quiet confidence and pride, but it certainly shouldn't verge into hubris. I personally believe very strongly that given the landscape that I described, again, the greatest number of challenges and the greatest complexity of challenges since the end of World War II, that the world very much needs American leadership. And I'd also say that that's not for charitable reasons from a U.S. perspective. It's because it's in our national interest, in our national security interest, in the interest of maintaining our prosperity and continually renewing it and so forth. That the so-called rules-based international order, for all of its imperfections and flaws and shortcomings, still is generally good for the world and certainly good for the United States and our allies and partners around the world.
Okay.
And so I think that we should continue to lead the world. Are we capable of that? We're raising some questions about that right now. I think the inability of Congress to come together to agree on the continued support for Ukraine, when it, again, is in our national security interest to do so. It's not charity. And if you think of the return on investment, by the way, we've provided $44 billion in security assistance to Ukraine, pledged that. The Europeans, by the way, have actually pledged a bit more, even in security, and then double what we've given if you take all the other categories in economic, financial, and humanitarian assistance. 60% of the Russian tank fleet has been destroyed. Again, that has dramatically reduced the threat to NATO countries. Again, this is a case of a brutal and unprovoked invasion decided upon by an individual who has a grievance-filled, revisionist, and revanchist view of history and should not be allowed to succeed. We should be doing everything we can to enable Ukraine. They're not asking us for our men and women to fight and die. They're fighting their own war of independence, and that's how they see it. And again, we need to come together to do that. And for those who say, well, but that is taking away from what we could be doing in the Indo-Pacific, that's where the real challenge is. And to be sure, the relationship between the U.S. and our Western allies and partners in China is far and away the most important in the world. But if you want to ensure that deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is solid, you have to ensure two elements. One is that the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and of your willingness to employ them on the other. And if we can't even provide continued assistance to a country that is now really fighting NATO's war for it, without asking for NATO soldiers to fight and die as part of it, that sends a very equivocal signal to those who, after we withdrew from Afghanistan, when we did not need to, we could have easily afforded it. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months.
We'll get to that too.
So forth. So again, you ask, are we capable of doing this? We are capable of doing it. The question is whether we have the fortitude to do it, whether there is sufficient ability on Capitol Hill in particular to overcome the partisanship that has characterized developments on that high ground in Washington and has really hamstrung our policies. I mean, the fact that we can't come together and do a package on Ukraine, the border, Israel, and Taiwan should be of cause for concern for all American citizens.
Let's talk a minute about Iran and Israel. Let's just start with Iran. We know just over the past weekend, President Biden authorized, I guess, between two different segments, around 90 airstrikes in Syria, Iraq, Yemen.
It's far more than that. It's way more than that. It's well over 100 different targets.
Well, in retaliation for well over 185 airstrikes from Yemen, from the Houthis and Hezbollah and Syrian insurgents. And so we've had this.
You're mixing all kinds of things together here, Thane, and we've taken far more than that. If you want to go all the way back in the beginning, there's no. Let me talk about Iran. Let me get to where I think. All right. They want to hear my view on Iran. Iran's leaders have three objectives: stay in power, keep the regime in power, destroy Israel, and drive the U.S. out of the Middle East. And to enable them to do that, they generally don't take us on directly. In fact, they almost never will. They use proxies, and they have built up very substantial proxies, obviously, particularly in southern Lebanon, in the form of Hezbollah, which also has a blocking veto in the parliament in Beirut. Obviously, Hamas has been on the receiving end of considerable funding, training, arming, and equipping. You have the Houthis in Yemen, who, of course, are disrupting the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. And then you have various militias, Shia militias in Iraq that are helping Iran to try to Lebanonize Iraq. In other words, to achieve in Iraq what they have achieved actually in Lebanon, which is to gain sufficient power in the parliament that they essentially have a veto or even better, and then to have a lot of muscle on the street so that they can intimidate, do whatever it is that is necessary there as well. So they're happy to fight to the last Houthi, to the last Hezbollah fighter, the last Hamas terrorist, the last Shia militia in Iraq, but generally not to take us on directly. And we have not directly struck them since 1979, when we actually did an airstrike to destroy our own aircraft when we aborted the effort to rescue our hostages at Desert One, the landing zone where they were being refueled.
So, General, the question I really wanted to get to was when people hear about airstrikes and against proxies, and they do the math about how many were fired against us and how many, I think people are confused about two things that I'd like you to talk about. One is the idea that we're fighting a war technically against Iran, but we're not ever attacking Iran in the same way that you just said they are unlikely to attack us. And secondly, when it comes to numbers, how do you know, because I want to move on from that into Gaza, the concept of proportionality. How do we know what the numbers are? How many airstrikes does it take for us to respond appropriately to the airstrikes since October 7th? And then we'll move on again to another.
Let me answer that question before you get another question. Let me just answer one at a time. The question is really, what are the objectives of a military action? I assume, I'm not sure I've heard that crystal clear, the objectives stated, but the objectives of the strikes against the Shia militia that have bases in Iraq and Syria, and which have carried out well over 160 attacks on our forces in Iraq and Syria, including the suicide drone that got through the defenses at the base in northeast in that sliver of area of Jordan that is right near the Iraq and Syria border and supports a base in Al Tanf, Syria, just inside the Iraq border. What the objectives, I believe, number one, is there's a degree of punishment. You can't kill 3 American soldiers and get away with that. And I think we've killed at least 17 or so. There is an effort to degrade the ability of these organizations to carry out further such attacks. And we hit 85 separate targets in this latest set of attacks, again, essentially in retaliation for those in Iraq and Syria. The Houthis, we have really a campaign to very substantially reduce their capability and capacity to carry out these attacks. So this has been a campaign ongoing to take out their radars, to degrade their command and control facilities, to destroy the stockpiles of weapons, to preempt the launching of missiles and drones when that is possible, obviously to defend against them as well. And it will not be, this is not something, the Houthis is not something that you're going to resolve in weeks, much less a shorter period, much less 1 or 2 sets of strikes. It's going to have to be a persistent, determined campaign to go after them. And that's what needs to be done. And I think that is what we are doing, actually, I think fairly impressively.
So in your book, you talked about the Cold War, and you said, well, there was a Cold War, but it's not as if there weren't proxies in those relationships during the war, that there were other wars happening that sort of played out the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, whether it was Korea, of course, Vietnam. And you, throughout the book, it's so wonderfully stated, laid out, well done. And I very much encourage people to read the book. But I'm wondering whether you would make the same argument here, that we've sort of been at war with the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and it hasn't really stopped. And that what we're seeing played out, whether it's Yemen or Syria or Iraq or Lebanon, are variations of the same thing, proxy wars. I guess Israel is certainly our proxy there. And I wonder whether that doesn't have its own Cold War, because I don't think people see Iran in the same way. And you know how I know this? Because we had an Iran deal. Was the Iran deal the same thing as the SALT agreements? I'm not sure. I'm not sure people see Iran in the same way.
Well, I'm uncomfortable with analogies because the other analogy is obviously that we're in a Cold War with China. And, you know, the truth is there are elements of the Cold War that are similar in the relationship between the U.S. and China. But then there's a huge difference. And when it comes to the U.S. and China, of course, China is our number 3 trading partner. I think we may be their number one. I mean, we never had any real meaningful economic or trade relationship with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So I'm always a bit cautious. In fact, my PhD dissertation talked about the lessons of history and how how they can be used and misused. I note that they can obfuscate as well as illuminate. So I'm actually more comfortable just describing what is going on without trying to make it an analogous to, again, the Cold War, which is a bit of a stretch. Although, again, there is no question that we are engaged with Iranian-supported proxies. There's no question that Israel is engaged with them. There's no question that the Gulf states at various times have been engaged in wars with proxies. Keep in mind that the Houthis not only survived, but in a sense prevailed in a civil war within Yemen that was supported on the Sunni side by the Saudis and the Emiratis, and on the Shia side, the Houthis by Iran. So I think it's just best to just try to describe what is actually going on without trying to draw an analogy, because I don't find that the explanatory power of those is that great in all cases.
So in the Cold War, when we had various negotiations, SALT agreements, we knew of the term of art, mad mutual assured destruction. When you think of Iran, one of the things I think most people what worry, certainly the Israelis, is that there was a sense during the Cold War that both the Soviet Union and the United States very much wanted to avoid uranium being in the skies and in the ground and having life end as we know it. But I think there is a fear that Iran would use a nuclear weapon, and that in this way, it's very different from the deterrent aspects of what we tried to achieve during the Cold War, that Iran, for whatever reasons, having a lot to do with Islamist thinking, that the idea of using it, or even using the language of wiping nations off the planet, of the map, is something that they could ultimately use, which makes it very different than the deterrence that we saw during the original Cold War.
Well, this is why the U.S. policy and the Israeli policy clearly stated and publicly stated is that we will never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. And I think Iran has deliberately held its enrichment. I'm not comfortable with where they are, but they're below weapons grade. And I think if they want to test our public policy, our public statement and commitment to ensure that they are not allowed to have a nuclear weapon, they go to weapons grade, and then they see. And I can tell the audience, it's all publicly known. When I was the commander of U.S. Central Command between commanding the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is command of the greater Middle East, everything from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north to Yemen in the pirate-infested waters off Somalia in the south. When I held that command, we developed the plan to destroy the Iran nuclear program. And it's also publicly known that we actually rehearsed that plan one time, and we also set the theater, it's called, so that we were very capable of doing that.
Now, can I ask you just, did we ever get close to making a decision?
We set the theater one time. And again, that gives you some indication that we were quite serious about being very well prepared. But the fact is, again, that they have, despite when we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, they're in a much, much more threatening position now than they were prior to that. There were shortcomings in that deal, to be sure, including most significantly the sunset clauses that gave a number of us concerns. But the fact is, and those sunset clauses would not have yet sunset, but they had given up all of their uranium above 1% and enrichment, and they even gave up 90% of that. They had quite an intrusive inspection procedure. You can argue about the lack of access to one site. I was less concerned about.
I thought there were issues that the cameras were broken, that the inspectors never really got a chance to look inside. That in fact, that's not true. We hear that, but that's not true. Okay. What about
there were frustrations about certain aspects of that, but there was quite an intrusive monitoring and inspection process, and we had quite clear understanding of what it was that they were doing.
Okay. Um, uh, let's go back to Israel for a moment. It's in the news every day, and I want to go back to the word proportionality. In your judgment, and we know the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel is not committing genocide or war crimes. But I think people are confused because of the body count, because of the disproportionate body count. In a culture, the use of the word proportionality has come up in Steven Spielberg's movie Munich. There's a discussion with Golda Meir and her generals about proportionality. There was an episode of The West Wing in the Situation Room. I remember very specifically where the president is saying, what does proportionality mean? I don't know what it means. He wants to do more. And the David Petraeuses of his world are staring at him and saying, Mr. President, this is what is considered proportionate. So can you explain, obviously proportionality doesn't mean one kill to one kill, that it does contemplate casualties of war and collateral damage. So what is Israel fighting this war under the rules of war and the rules of engagement without committing war crimes?
Well, it's very hard to know because none of us have actually inside knowledge of what the targets are. Keep in mind that there's a tension between two terms in the laws of land warfare, the Geneva Convention, which of course were brought into being in response to the horrors of World War II. And I should note that we adhered as closely as we absolutely could to our interpretation of the Geneva Convention. Not that we didn't make mistakes along the way. And by the way, those mistakes generally proved to be costly. Abu Ghraib was a terrible mistake. It was a mistreatment of detainees in a very, very graphic manner. And those images still haunt us to this day. They were caused a very negative reaction in the region, and they should have. There are others. There are also mistakes that are made. And when I was the commander in both Iraq and Afghanistan, keep in mind I had 5 combat commands. During those combat commands, we made mistakes, but it was not deliberate. It's because someone misinterpreted what they saw through the thermal sight of an Apache attack helicopter at 3 a.m, or because we failed to understand that this was not an extremist group, that it was a wedding party. I mean, all of these actually took place. The key is to adhere to those rules of laws of land warfare as close as you absolutely and possibly can. And sometimes it means that your own forces take greater risk. The reason that I'm hesitant to second guess in this case is because I don't know the nature of the targets. I don't know the weaponeering. You would literally do weapons effects assessments in 3 dimensions before you use large munitions, especially in urban areas. We very seldom used large munitions in urban areas. We almost never used non-precision ones. And so there are concerns that I have. The amount of damage and the amount of loss of innocent civilian life does generate concern as a former commander. But again, without knowing specifically what the target was, what was the urgency, what was the military necessity of that target, the imperative, versus what was the understanding, the expectation of what the collateral damage would be in terms of loss of innocent civilian life, injuries, damage to infrastructure, and so forth. We had a sign on the walls of my command posts right up by the display maps staring at me in these different combat commands, and it asked a question. It asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? That's a slightly different test. You can have, an operation that can meet, again, the laws of land warfare, but you still might create more bad guys than you take off the street. So if the answer to that question is no, you generally should take a really hard look at it, see if you can't get to yes. If you can't get to yes, you should really, again, think very long and hard before you carry out an action that could actually create more bad guys because of the way it is done. And I will tell you that I strongly agree with the need to destroy Hamas. I see Hamas as an extremist army. This is the Islamic State. Yes, it's an imperfect analogy as well, There's an element of Palestinian nationalism that with Hamas that is undeniable, but it is not an organization with which you can reconcile the way that we reconciled with over 103,000 Sunni low-level insurgents and Shia militia in Iraq during the surge in Iraq. That was the Anbar awakening. And by the way, the surge wasn't part of the awakening. The awakening was one element of the overall civil military counterinsurgency campaign that we conducted. Reconciliation is a better term.
Well, I'll get to that in a minute.
Let me finish I'm about to get into Gaza, though, so let me finish my explanation here. So I do believe destruction is necessary. Destruction in a military mission sense means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Keep your mind on reconstitution here. You have to prevent that. That's an element of the strategy that is not yet present, as I'll explain. So destruction doesn't mean to kill or capture every last Hamas extremist or terrorist. It means to, again, render them incapable of accomplishing their mission. And you have a sense of that. There's a degree of subjectivity here, but it's not something with which we struggled during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we did destroy al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Sunni insurgent groups and actually the Shia militia during the 18 months of the surge as well. They've also said that they want to dismantle the Hamas political wing. I agree wholeheartedly with that. You can never allow Hamas to administer Gaza again, or Hamas as the military wing will be able to reconstitute. It will be allowed to do so. And then there is obviously the imperative of recovering the hostages. That's in tension with objective number one, without question. But if you could facilitate that further, having already gotten over 100 out, as I recall, with a 1 month or 2 month ceasefire, I think that would be there would be wisdom in that, even if you don't perhaps get all of them in that effort. Noting that it would allow Hamas some degree of breathing room. The problem, Thane, with these objectives is that they are, I believe, again, necessary, but as elements of a strategy, they are not sufficient. There need to be additional objectives established. And one of those should be to make life better for the Palestinian people. They should announce this and commit to it. There's nowhere for them to go. The idea you can just destroy Gaza or something like that, there is no country that's going to take them. And this is where, again, there should be concern about hearts and minds. So this should be seen as a counterinsurgency campaign rather than as a conventional military campaign. And we conducted operations like this repeatedly during the surge. We did. Ramadi, Akuba, please, Thane, please, let me finish here. And we know how to do this, but we had a force that was completely professional. We were on our third or fourth year in Iraq. We'd overhauled all aspects of our preparation of our forces. We had a counterinsurgency doctrine that I oversaw the drafting of and then training of our forces on. And by the way, the civilian life was, again, something that we tried very hard to preserve because we were going to own these areas when we were done. It's a process called clear. So you clear an area of the enemy and then you hold it. And we would hold it by literally creating gated communities as a description. And we did 12 or 13 of them in Fallujah alone. Now, none of these locations were anywhere near as fiendishly difficult as is Gaza, given the 350 miles of tunnel, the underground infrastructure, storage sites under mosques, schools, hospitals, etc. But this can be done, and it should be done. And because I think at the end of the day, Israel is going to end up owning Gaza for a period of time at least. And again, it needs to get the civilians back into their homes, such as they are, and then begin the process of rebuilding and showing them that life will be better once Hamas is out of your neighborhood. And that's a critical component. By the way, they're also going to have to maintain quite a substantial security presence, much more than just being in this buffer zone, to ensure that Hamas cannot reconstitute. So this is a very long-term campaign. We're about 3.5 to 4 months into this. Only northern Gaza has been reasonably cleared, and because the hold phase is not yet getting enough attention, you can see Hamas beginning to reconstitute in northern Gaza, and that's problematic, even as they are shifting more focus to central and southern Gaza, noting that southern Gaza is, of course, where the leader of Hamas military wing, Yahya Sinwar, is undoubtedly surrounded by hostages and civilians deep underground. Very, very challenging campaign. But again, I think there has to be a consideration, a much greater consideration, actually, for laying out what life will be like for the Palestinians when Hamas is no longer in their lives.
But I'm sure the Israelis would hear this and say, well, that is applying General Petraeus's counterinsurgency / surge techniques that worked to some degree very well in Iraq and in Afghanistan. But the population of Gazans are very different. So when General Petraeus uses the words hearts and minds, he's using those words very casually because
no, I'm not using them casually. I did this for a living.
Yep. Let me finish.
Sure.
The Israelis would say, I think you're talking about a general population that was very much unlike what General Petraeus saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, who are in some ways civilian participants who gave much more aid and comfort, who were hiding, storing weapons, giving up children as human shields, that the relationship between Hamas fighters and civilians is very different. It's not just that they're not wearing uniforms, it's that they really, Hamas in polling is showing both in the West Bank and in Gaza, General, wildly popular. Still, even after October 7th, wildly popular. And I think that what you say in your book, which I thought was interesting to be reminded of, that when the United States first entered Afghanistan and Iraq, they were welcomed. They were looking to be liberated. They were thrilled that Petraeus was there. But I don't think that the same thing can be said about Gazans.
Well, I will take some issue with that. I am very aware of the sentiment of the population. I've actually been in the West Bank. I used to meet with the leaders in Ramallah and so forth. I know reasonably the population. I know all the issues and concerns that are repeatedly raised. But I think there's no alternative to this, Shane. If there is not concern about hearts and minds, and I'm not saying they're going to flip like this. We didn't flip hearts and minds like this. The Sunni Arabs were supporting al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were supporting the Sunni insurgents. They were the insurgents. Some of them turned out to be reconcilable. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was not. We destroyed them. And they stayed destroyed for the subsequent 3.5 years until unwisely we pulled out our combat forces and the Iraqis took their eye off them and they were able to reconstitute. Again, keep in mind, reconstitute here. But this is an issue that has to be resolved. And you don't do it, it's not going to happen at all quickly, but it should be shown to the Israeli people. Instead of closing Al-Shifa Hospital, it should have kept open and made to look what right looks like and actually used to treat the civilians. But you have to keep it secure. Because again, keep in mind, clear, hold, and build. There's going to have to be a relationship between the Israeli Defense Force soldiers on the ground and the Palestinian people, because there's no other organization that's going to come in there that is capable, competent, and trustworthy and is going to ensure that Hamas cannot reconstitute. And that's the conundrum that the IDF faces. And the sooner I think that they actually recognize this, and I've had conversations. And look, I talk to Israelis all the time, both former and serving. And this is a huge conundrum. There's nothing but bad choices here. But I think the least bad choice is to recognize that Israel is going to have to end up administering and securing Gaza for a reasonable period of time, even as they figure out how it is they can establish, if you will, host area institutions and so forth, and get the lights back on and the water working and all the rest of this. So again, Fallujah was not a cakewalk. The people were
Right.
throwing roses at us when we did it the third time. We failed 2 times. And
So
the third time it was, this is very technology intensive. We created biometric ID cards for every individual in Fallujah to enable us to ensure that they had access to the neighborhood, et cetera. And then over time, gradually, when you start to show them that life is actually going to be better without Al Qaeda in their midst, and again, this is the equivalent of Al Qaeda. Yes, an even more challenging landscape. As I said, this is more fiendishly difficult, but the principles and the concepts are still very valid here.
I just want the audience to know more concretely what you're talking about in terms of the counterinsurgency techniques. By the way, you wrote the book on it. You wrote the actual field manual that's being used in the military academies on counterinsurgency. So I want to be clear with the audience when we're talking about one of the things that you talked about, money as being discretionary funds, that is its own munition, money as a weapon. You talked about the return of street life, making life interesting, letting people walk the streets safely, new public works. One of the things that was interesting that I read in your book that I didn't know, you were responsible for reopening the University of Mosul. Well,
Yes.
like saying, wow, that's a really great idea. Get the university open, restore actual life. So I just want to make sure the audience understands what you're saying about what Israel needs to own. They need to own an idea that they will, that with money and efforts and living among the people, that hearts and minds can be changed and drawn away from whatever the appeal of Hamas. I'm sure, again, I'm merely the moderator here, I'm sure Israelis would say, someone is saying, we don't think the Gazans can be bought off in the same way. We don't think that street life will make sense. On the other hand, I would say some of that worked in the West Bank. So I think that what you're saying has applied to some degree in the West Bank. Let me just talk about, since you were also the CIA director.
Perfectly, by the way, you captured this beautifully. I fully acknowledge that this is far more challenging, but I would submit that there is no alternative. Because if this is not done, if all that is done is they kill an awful lot of, again, members of Hamas, lots of them, and destroy their facilities and kill a lot of civilians, and then leave, what is that going to leave behind? It is going to be the most fertile ground for the replanting of the seeds of Hamas 2.0 that would be even more virulent and more extreme. By the way, one thing we have not yet seen is, to my knowledge at least, is much use of suicide bombers, which we faced in great numbers. So that was the one aspect that was much more pernicious in Iraq. It changes everything because you literally have to keep every person at beyond arm's length in every vehicle. And if they don't obey, in some cases, you engage them. Hopefully, touch wood, that will not be something that we'll see practiced in Gaza. But again, I don't see an alternative thing. And again, I spent, the better part of my adult life studying and then actually implementing. So not only did we write the counterinsurgency field manual after I'd already had nearly 2.5 years in Iraq and had done a dissertation on Vietnam, et cetera. We then got to implement it. Iraq, it did work. When you drive violence down by 85 to 90%, and it continues to go down for 3.5 subsequent years, until, again, unfortunately, we withdrew our combat forces and the Iraqis took seriously bad decisions. But that was very sustainable. Afghanistan is different. There's a whole host of reasons why: sanctuaries, lack of infrastructure, money, central government. It's just a much, much more challenging circumstance. But even there, we had a situation that was sustainable, however imperfect and frustrating and maddening.
Well, maddening and frustrating. I must tell you, in reading your book, in the moments discussing Afghanistan and Iraq and your surge techniques and counterinsurgency techniques, it was heartbreaking because I felt that you had made great progress and then there was a few steps back. You made some progress, then we learned that we had corrupt local leaders. So we had free elections. Petraeus, creates a whole new infrastructure of a local governance, and the next thing you know, we have corruption. So I actually read it as a as a cautionary tale to say these are great ideas, but you need to have willing customers who buy in and won't betray Petraeus, so to speak, that they will buy in and stick with this. And I think that even though this was successful in Iraq and Afghanistan, watching your level of patience was actually extraordinary, because you must have felt an enormous amount of frustration. Let's talk about the war on terror before we take a question from the audience and say goodnight. Given the fact that you've had these experiences in the military and with the CIA, in your view, is there still a war on terror? I think the congressional authorizations for the war on terror have never closed. So in theory, the United States still has a war on terror. I don't know what that actually means. Is that around the world, or is that confined to regions? Is there still a war on terror? Is the United States engaged in it? Is it something that can be won? I'm just curious if you can weigh in, because we seem to forget that term of art. That's how we know you. We know you. You were already well known within the military. We know you because of the war on terror.
We are still and must still keep an eye and pressure on Islamist extremist groups wherever they are in the world. Ideally, we do this by advising, assisting, and enabling local partners, as we had been doing successfully in Iraq. Keep in mind, we went back into Iraq to help them destroy the Islamic State and its caliphate in northern Iraq, and we enabled the Syrian Democratic Forces to do the same thing in Syria. The reason why we are still in Syria and Iraq is at the request of our local partners. However, again, however fragile this relationship may be between the Iraqi prime minister and our forces now, but we are there at their request to enable them to do that. That's the way to do it, is help host nation partners rather than having to do it yourself. We occasionally carry out our own counterterrorism operations using special mission units or drones or that kind of thing. We're doing the same thing in East Africa. We were doing that in Northwest Africa. It's a bit more problematic there. But if we do not do that, Shane, these forces will do what the Islamic State did after our combat forces left and after the Iraqi security forces took their eye off them, because they got involved in highly sectarian activities decided on by the prime minister, which was a very flawed idea, but that enabled them to reconstitute. This is very relevant for Hamas. This is why I said, keep your eye on that term in the doctrinal definition of destroy, render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution, because Israel is going to have to ensure that they cannot reconstitute in a territory that is obviously right next door and well within range of populated areas, et cetera. So that's yet another challenge and another, I believe, something that should be an explicit objective for Israel. So yes, we are not only still authorized by the authorization to use military force that was approved in the wake of the 9/11 attacks by Congress and signed into law, we still are using that authorization. And we are helping, again, host nation partners literally around the world. There are some activities also out in the Indo-Pacific region. Keep in mind what took place in the southern Philippines with partners there. There's some lingering challenges in southern Thailand. And we have to keep an eye on them, because otherwise they'll be back, just as the Islamic State was able to come back.
Cyber warfare.
Yes.
How do we fight that war? Is it fought through computers and the internet? Do we need to have General Petraeuses who are computer scientists? Or is this the kind of thing that is really still fought in conventional terms, reminding nations that are conducting the... Go ahead.
It's fought in all domains, Thane. Obviously, the principal domain in which it is being pursued is cyberspace. But you use diplomacy, you use international law, national law, you use forensics, financial experts. Again, in all of these, by the way, as in, again, Gaza as well, there always has to be a comprehensive, integrated strategy. This is why we say that a counterinsurgency is a comprehensive civil military campaign. Military is necessary. The security component is the foundation on which all else is built, but it's the all else that actually solidifies the security foundation that you have achieved and enables you to do more. And the same is true in that domain that is now referred to as cyberspace. We've taken a number of actions over the years, the creation of U.S. Cyber Command within the military, the elevation of Cyber Command to a full-fledged combatant command, the creation of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, working for the Department of Homeland Security, but also as an agency as well. Additional capabilities in the Department of Justice and the FBI. The list goes on and on. But all of this is what we do. And that's how we have to go about it. We were slow in some areas in the cybersecurity realm. We were behind the UK, for example, in the development of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. But we are very much moving forward in this area. And we've had extraordinarily good people lead CISA and Cyber Command and some of these other initiatives.
All right, I'm going to give you one last question from me and then from the audience, and we'll say goodnight to the general. In your book, you raised a number of things that I had never thought about before. But one of those things is that you don't say it this way, but it seems like the American military establishment institutions are somewhat haunted by both still Vietnam and Somalia. And I thought that was an interesting observation. And I'm wondering, do you think that that's something will always be part of the American military psyche, that we were stuck in a war in Vietnam, one where we didn't have the right objectives, maybe, where we didn't fight it out correctly, we didn't know how to do it. And secondly, the nightmare of what many people now know to be the movie Black Hawk Down, that they know, that's how they know what Somalia is from that film, that what happened to the American, and these were special forces, these were Texas Rangers, right? This was the most elite, and that movie is horrifying. And I'm wondering whether you think that that's something that maybe still penetrates, still lingers in the minds of people who train our military, or that's something you're saying, no, we learned those lessons and we're past it.
No, I think lessons of history are ever present. I think they have a bit of a half-life. That half-life can be extended by other experiences. The Mogadishu Mile moment there, the Battle of Somalia, a Battle of Mogadishu, did in a way remind us of the lessons of Vietnam, which George H.W. Bush had said were buried in the sands of Operation Desert Storm, which turned out not to be completely accurate. But now there are also newer lessons, I think. There are lessons of Iraq. There are lessons of Afghanistan. We should be careful to try to distill those lessons, to take from them what is correct. There are lessons from Benghazi. Again, I think any of our experiences, good or bad, have some degree of lesson attached to them. The key for decision makers, I believe, having academically looked at this, and there's a whole body of literature about how these experiences weigh on decision makers, particularly during crisis decision making, but then having engaged in crisis decision making as well, is to be aware of what intellectual baggage you bring, to be conscious of these lessons, but not let them overly push you in one direction or another. I would argue, for example, that the military, because of the lessons of Vietnam, overlearned them for a period of time. It was literally, we don't ever want to do this again. We don't even want to be ready to do it again. And so we won't. And the problem is that you don't get to pick and choose the type of war to which you're committed by a president of the United States. And here we were fighting some degree, something like Vietnam. In other words, it was a war among the people, irregular warfare. And by the way, what we should learn from Vietnam is that it took us 13 years from the beginning of our involvement in the mid-1950s until 1968, when General Abrams took over. It took us that long to finally craft the appropriate strategy for what it was we were doing in Vietnam. We tried to fight a battle of attrition, search and destroy operations that had very ephemeral effects. And despite all the courage and technology and all the other elements that were present, if you have the wrong big ideas, if you have the wrong strategy, everything else you do is building on a shaky intellectual foundation. And with respect, what I've tried to do here with respect to Gaza is to lay out what I believe should be the big ideas that guide it, some elements of which are present now, and I think some elements of which need to be added to that particular approach, and that it should be seen again as in a regular warfare, a counterinsurgency campaign rather than a conventional military campaign.
All right, let me just get one quick audience question and we'll say goodnight. Let me see if we can do this quickly.
I'm happy to stay as long as they want to stay.
Yeah, this one says, so far Ukraine has had limited ability to hit targets at long range. Would the progress of the war change, and how, if long-range weapons in sufficient numbers and in a timely way were delivered? It's a good question.
It would be very, very helpful. I have argued for more than well over a year, that we should have provided the Army tactical missile system to Ukraine. That would have a range of 300 kilometers as opposed to the current munitions we're providing that have a range of about 150 kilometers. In fact, we have seen what they can do with longer range weapons, the anti-ship missiles that they have been provided and also developed indigenously. Remember that they were really the military industrial heartland to a considerable degree of the then Soviet Union. In fact, when I first visited there, and they were still part of the USSR, and we visited some of these factories. So it would be, and I believe that I'm non-political, by the way, in America. I don't even register to vote, much less vote or support candidates. And I talk to members of either party routinely. I believe that the U.S. response to Ukraine has been impressive in general. I don't think Putin actually expected that we would do that, especially after we withdrew from Afghanistan in the way that we did it. But that we have delayed decisions that I always thought were inevitable and proved to be inevitable because we did actually make them, but we made them too late. We delayed far too long in the decision to provide U.S. tanks, which meant that the Germans delayed their decision to provide the Leopard tanks and allow other countries with Leopards to give them to Ukraine when it was clear there were no more Eastern Bloc tanks anywhere in NATO forces or elsewhere to provide to Ukraine. So they were running out of those. Western aircraft, again, there were no more MiGs in Poland, Hungary, the Eastern European countries that used to have MiGs. They gave them all to Ukraine. We needed to have made that decision far sooner. If they had had air power during the summer offensive, it would have been quite advantageous. It might not have been decisive, but I'd sure like to have seen whether it would have been. There are a variety of other munitions and so forth where we delayed too long, in my view, even though we have provided a very, very substantial amount without question. And I think we have led the effort, in a sense, diplomatically in an impressive fashion as well, ensuring that NATO stayed together, ensuring that Putin could not drive a wedge between Europe and North America, a whole variety of different ways in which I think we have done an admirable job. But I wish we would make decisions much more rapidly. And one of those would be for longer range munitions. And I'm happy to take one more if you want as well, Shane.
No, we're good. We're good. We got a few more announcements. Quick announcement before good night to the general. Let's see. Upcoming events. Yes. Take out your phones. We've got a QR code. This event is both live and virtual. The future of the First Amendment. We have Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, former president of the ACLU, Nadine Strawson, leading First Amendment attorney Floyd Abrams. You can also register not just with the QR code, but go to the chat box and get the link. And we have an event, I think the very next month, we have a save the date. And this is sort of a recitation discussion of all the legal cases against Donald Trump. And we have the chief legal correspondent for CNN and for MSNBC, and a former U.S. attorney from the Southern District of New York. We are, in fact, so mark that date down. There'll be more notices about that. Let's see what else. The donate slide. There we go. We are a nonprofit. If you enjoyed listening to General Petraeus and learned a lot, which is, as we always say, is the model of what a FOLCS conversation is about, to learn a lot. We're a nonprofit. There's your QR code for donating. And in order to stay in touch for future events, there you go. Another QR code that you can find out by just if you watched us live on YouTube or on Facebook, make sure that you register for future events, and you'll be able to see, again, the kinds of the quality of the talk show that we offer today. General Petraeus, I want to thank you again for your incredible service to this country. I want to also say that I would love to see you return to public life. You have a lot of ideas. You said something earlier that I don't think people picked up on when I asked about, you making the transition to civilian life. I think what you were saying was, well, Thane, I've been bouncing around all along. I was doing this, and then I went and taught. Then I got a PhD, and then I went and did this, as if to say, I have a very agile and capacious mind, and I'm ready to pick up new things all the time. So I hope that you'll share these ideas and your presence in public life. We'd like to see more of you. General, thank you. And I want to thank the... Go ahead. Sorry, General.
Most enjoyable. Thank you. A real privilege to be with you. Thanks for what you do for debate and share ideas.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear, General. All right, this is Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS. Until next time with General Petraeus. Good night, everyone. Thank you.